Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's History at High Noon program, History at High Noon, Even as We Breathe, in celebration of American Indian Heritage Month. My name is Stacy, and I handle adult education here at the North Carolina Museum of History, and we're so glad that you're joining us for today's lunchtime lecture program. If you enjoyed today's program, we invite you to head over to the museum's website, ncmuseumofhistory.org, where you can learn more about upcoming programs, exhibits, and digital resources. This is also where you can find more information about shopping in our wonderful museum shop and joining our North Carolina Museum of History Associates. Our associates and foundation provide crucial funding and support to the museum, which in addition to many other things, helps make programs like today's program possible. We would also like to thank those of you who kindly donated funds towards today's program. We do our best to keep our programs free to attend, but there are costs associated with keeping our series going, and we just continue to be so appreciative of your generous support of the museum. As a special part of today's program, our guest speaker's book, Even as We Breathe, is available for sale in the museum shop. You can grab your copy either by stopping by the museum during regular business hours or shopping online at ncmuseumofhistoryshop.com. A few quick housekeeping items for today's program. We ask that you please keep your mics muted throughout the entirety of the event, and to please type any questions that you have for our guest speaker into the chat function located at the bottom center of your screen. At the end of the lecture, our adult programs intern Bobby will ask our speaker as many of your questions as time allows. All right, so it is my honor to introduce today's speaker, Annette Saunooke Clapsaddle. Annette is an enrolled member of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians and resides in Qualla, North Carolina, with her husband, Evan, and sons, Ross and Charlie. She holds degrees from Yale University and the College of William and Mary. Her debut novel, Even as We Breathe, was released by the University Press of Kentucky in 2020, a finalist for the Weatherford Award and named one of NPR's best books of 2020. Her first novel manuscript, Going to Water, is the winner of the Morningstar Award for Creative Writing from the Native American Literature Symposium in 2012 and a finalist for the Penn Bellwether Prize for Socially Engaged Fiction 2014. Clapsaddle's work has appeared in Yes Magazine, Lit Hub, Smoky Mountain Living Magazine, South Writ Large, and The Atlantic. After serving as executive director of the Cherokee Preservation Foundation, Annette returned to teaching at Swain County High School. She is the former co-editor of the Journal of Cherokee Studies and serves on the board of trustees for the North Carolina Writers Network. Okay, Annette, I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Stacy. Thanks for having me, and thank you to the North Carolina Museum of History for having me today. One of the first things I need to tell you is that I am speaking to you today from the school that I teach at, Swain County High School in Bryson City, North Carolina. So you may hear a bell periodically or announcements or maybe even students. So we'll just roll with it. It's kind of in the middle of lunch periods and whatnot. But I'm happy to be able to carve out a little bit of my day and to spend with folks. I thought I would start by telling you a little bit about the book if you're unfamiliar, give you some kind of background on how the idea came about and the process of writing it, and also do a little bit of a reading for you. So if you haven't read it, it's Even as We Breathe. I promise not to give any spoilers. And the book is set partly in Asheville, North Carolina at the Grove Park Inn and Resort, and partly in Cherokee, North Carolina, so western part of the state. Many of you may be familiar with the Grove Park Inn. But in 1942, the summer of 1942, the Grove Park Inn held Axis diplomats and foreign nationals as prisoners of war. It was only for one summer, but I found that to be a fascinating fact, a fact I didn't really know much about. So I set the novel during that summer, and the protagonist, County Sequoia, is a 19-year-old young Cherokee man who comes from Cherokee to work on the grounds of the Grove Park that summer. And he's joined by Essie Stamper, a 19-year-old Cherokee woman who is going to the Grove Park to work in the inn while the prisoners of war are there. Both County and Essie are trying to raise a little bit of money, probably for college. Essie knows that that's what she's doing, and County's just trying to figure out what he wants to do next. In the midst of this, County is also trying to unravel a family secret back home in Cherokee, and he is eventually accused of being involved in the disappearance of a diplomat's daughter while he's working at the inn. County becomes enamored with Essie, and they build this unique bond while they're both working there, and are trying to navigate that relationship. It's a pretty special relationship. So I have lived in Western North Carolina my entire life, in Cherokee, except for when I went away to college and graduate school. And a few years ago, there was an article in the Asheville Citizen-Times that was talking about Asheville's role during World War II. Specifically, they were talking about the Biltmore House, safeguarding precious works of art during that time period. But there was a small paragraph that described how the Grove Park Inn operated as a prison during that summer. And I was fascinated by that because I had lived in the area my entire life. I felt like that was a history I should know. I'm married to a former history teacher and a current historian, in fact. And I started asking local historians if they were aware of that history. But I couldn't find much information. The Grove Park Inn has a little bit of that information on display and in a book that they have published. But even in the book, it's probably about a half a page worth of material, which is not that surprising considering the circumstances. But it was just enough of reality for me to have the latitude to start writing this fictional piece. I was mostly interested in the fact that you have this upper class resort, a place that I can't afford to stay at, that all of a sudden becomes a place of imprisonment, that you have one-time diplomats who are now prisoners. And I'm also aware of the history of some Japanese internment camps being set up on Indian reservations out west. And that's always been a really intriguing question for me in terms of citizenship and how place becomes prison. So I thought that I'd just use this setting and turn the heat up on it a little bit and bring in my protagonist from the sovereign nation of the Eastern Band. And really explore motifs of citizenship and belonging and labels in this setting. So this is a piece that I consider very much setting driven, not just place, but also the time period and the cultural context that is taking place during this summer. So I'll talk a little bit more about kind of how this narrative evolved, but I thought I would root us all in the book by just reading the prologue. I like to read the prologue even if folks have already read the book, because I think it does come full circle and illuminate some of the themes of the book. And there are no spoilers in the prologue, so it's a nice piece to just share with you to get you rooted in the characters and the place. So this is from the prologue of Even As We Breathe. About the place, when I take you there or when you find it on your own, just know that what the old folks say is true. This land is ours because of what is buried in the ground, not what words appear on paper. But also know this, what is buried in the ground isn't always what you think. It's just the beginning. It's the beginning of the story, the beginning of all of us who call ourselves Homo sapiens. Fitting, I guess, that what I found buried, just as I was trying to figure out how to become a man and still be human, was the very thing that threatened to take it all away. Just when I began to see what taking control of my own life might look like, I realized I was not who I thought, and neither was this place. That summer in 1942, when I met her, really met her. Before I found myself in a white man's cage and entangled in the barbed wire that destroyed my father, I left the cage of my home in Cherokee, North Carolina. I left these mountains that both hold and suffocate and went to work at the pinnacle of luxury and privilege, Asheville's Grove Park Inn and Resort. I guess I convinced myself that I could become fortunate by proximity, escape Uncle Bud's tirades and my grandmother Leashy's empty kitchen cabinets just by driving a couple of hours up the road. It sounded good to tell folks I was raising money for college, but the truth was I didn't know what I was doing. I just didn't want to do it there anymore. And if I stayed any longer, I would become rooted so deeply I might as well have been buried. My plan didn't quite work the way I thought it would. When I got to the resort, I mostly stayed outside, cut the trees, mowed the grass, and helped to dig holes that would sink signs and posts for barbed wire fences. Music occasionally seeped from the ballroom, but was muted by thick lead-paned windows before one note ever reached the perimeter of the property. That's where I first found the bone. I was on my hands and knees, pitching rocks and digging holes. It was just as the inn, like its music, was becoming dulled by wartime restrictions and hushed by lead bullets. The prisoners, who were actually diplomats and foreign nationals treated more like guests, weren't really known to me yet. That little girl, God bless her soul, had barely even stepped foot on the property, and I was still as free as I would ever be. I squatted there by the fence along the boundary of the Grove Park property and grasped the bone by its middle, pointing both ends upward, studying its curvature. A bent bauble for my idle adolescent hands to fidget with in absence of a ball stick or a soldier's rifle. I can't recall playing with many toys as a child. That's probably why the bone spoke poetry to me as a young man. It was smooth and porous, its slight C curve angled in motion, calling to be grasped, used, a weapon, at least in some primitive function of strength. Like a subhuman sight, though innately human, maybe even the very core of humanity. And now, as I recall the moment out loud, it was an embarrassing indulgence of make-believe for a 19-year-old. It's all right to laugh, I don't blame you. Such an extraordinary object to be inside flesh. It was wholly earthen, not sterile or cellular. It was natural in a way we pray our body is not, momentary, seasonal, destined for expiration. The bone had lost its story, petrified into a mere alkaline deposit, transient and nameless. I was immediately spellbound by this calcified opportunity to embrace a remnant of life's existence in one hand, dry it, dust it, preserve it, and listen. Buried by a story, and I was the only one on this earth privileged to hear it. Counting. It seemed to coo my name like the beautiful girls of my daydreams, the ones who never took interest in boys like me. Just as I was yet to know of a certain beautiful girl's power, I was yet to understand the power that bone would wield over my life. I was yet to know how much more I would risk for her, for it. I am bits and pieces of the people I meet, my teacher once told me. Though more accurately, I am of people and places and creatures. And so because of that summer and that war and that small hollow relic, I am bits and pieces of a grand estate and a half-tame primate and a dozen accents and a missing girl and a fearful girl and all the trees and mountains and asphalt in between. And you, well, I reckon you will be too soon enough. Knowing that she is now gone from this earth, all I'm left to do is wonder what remains of her here, for me, for anyone who knew or didn't know her. What happens to the memories? How long do they survive? I can still see her dancing, head thrown back laughing. If there's one thing old age has taught me, it's that there are many kinds of love. She taught me that sometimes we feel many different kinds with one person. And now it seems possible that love is the only thing that will outlive us all, but only if we continue to tell its story. So that's the prologue, and I wrote probably 90% of that prologue in a tiny room, basically like a closet, in the Jackson County Library in Sylva, North Carolina. I have another novel manuscript that's unpublished, and I was kind of in this process of trying to find an agent for it, being really discouraged by the whole process of publication. And so I decided I wanted to write something completely new and different. And to be honest with you, I can't remember which came first, the news article or this section. But I went to the library and I gave myself the writing prompt to write as long as I possibly could on the simplest object I could think of. And I just wanted to generate new material, and was really stuck of what to write. So I decided I would write about a clean bone. And so I sat in this closet of a room for probably a couple of hours and just free wrote about a bone. And it eventually led to wondering what the story of that bone was and why it was significant. Which then led me to think more thematically about how we determine identity of human beings, who belongs where, when, who is a part of a place, and when are they allowed to be a part of that place, and what elements do we use to determine identity? Most often, if we think about it, we use those very superficial aspects of a human, skin color and DNA and things like that, to determine who belongs in any particular group or place. And I also was reminded of a story of when I used to work for our chief. I worked in our principal chief's office, and my office was right next to his, so I could kind of hear through the walls some of those discussions he would have. And one day there was a local representative, I won't give names, who paid him a visit because this representative's jurisdiction, the place that he represented, wanted to expand their airport runway. And in doing so, it would completely unearth native burial ground. There was plenty of archaeological evidence that this place was the site of Cherokee burials. And the representative, of course, was seeking approval to do this. And I remember our chief having to put it very plainly to the individual. And he said, I want you to imagine if I were to go up to the cemetery and dig up your grandmother, and how that would make you feel. And I think that's the first time that maybe this representative had been asked to think about it in those terms. Because typically what we've seen is that native bones are treated like artifacts. They're in museums, they're studied, right? They're relics of the past, but rarely are they connected to the humanity, or sometimes, I don't know, I should say rarely, but not often are they connected to the humanity of a people. And that's always stuck with me, to think about, to make that connection for somebody about our culture and how similar it is to other cultures. And so when I was writing about this bone, it really led to the themes of the book in general. And so if you read the book, you'll see that there are other ways that I try to draw in those connections. You may have picked up in the prologue that I mentioned a primate. There is a monkey in the book, and since this is for the the Museum of History, I'll try to illuminate all of the historically accurate parts of the book. So in addition to the fact that the Grove Park did hold access diplomats and prisoners of war, or diplomats and foreign nationals as prisoners of war, there was also a monkey that roamed the woods kind of free range. Not exactly the exact time period and the place, maybe a little bit different. But Gary Carden, who's a storyteller from Jackson County, tells this story. I think the monkey's name was Abner originally. But there was a monkey that used just to roam around and scare hunters and people in the woods. And I always thought that was a really funny story. And as I thought about it more deeply and thematically, I started thinking about how, evolutionary science tells us that we are most closely related to primates if we, look to the animal kingdom for our relatives, and that's widely accepted. But a stereotype in Native literature is that Native peoples have some weird magical connection with nature, and we can talk to animals like Pocahontas or something. And so I want to push back against those stereotypes. So what I did was include the creature that Cherokees believe that we are most closely related to, which are bears. And so there are a couple of scenes in the novel where there are encounters with bears, and they're portrayed in almost human-like, with human-like qualities. Not because there is some magical connection between County and these bears because he's Cherokee, but just to make the point that just as we can accept that primates are relatives of ours, we can also accept that bears are relatives of ours, and we have that connection to the environment, regardless of whether we are indigenous people or non-indigenous people on this land. So I try to do things like that throughout the novel to draw connections between people, and also to share aspects of our culture, and to show that our culture is not all that different. We just have a little bit different worldview sometimes than greater American culture or world culture. So the novel is largely focused on two settings, physical place settings, right? So the Grove Park and Cherokee. And I needed to do some research about the time period. And so again, since this is for the Museum of History, I'm sure there are questions about what kind of research I did. And it's set in 1942. So as I mentioned, there's not a lot of archival information about that summer, specifically what was happening on the property of the Grove Park. I found what I could. I talked to a historian from the Grove Park, and then I really largely relied on photography. I went and looked at photographs from the region from that time period, and I wanted to study the landscape, how it had changed and how it hadn't changed. I spent a lot of time looking at things like roads between Cherokee and Asheville, and what that would have felt like to travel it. One of the reasons that's important to me is because I believe that good literature is felt in the body. And so I wanted to make sure that when I'm describing a scene, whether it is 2021 or 1942, that the reader has the opportunity to feel it in the body, to feel being there as much as possible. Not just what it looks like, not just what it sounds like, but the pressure on the body, the air temperature, what it feels like to travel a road during that time period. All of that's very important to me, and photography helps me to get to that place, to set that scene, the details of that scene. The other thing I had to do was to make sure that any product, for example, was available in the summer of 1942, but specifically was available in Cherokee or Asheville, wherever it was placed in the novel. And to remember that this is wartime, so some things weren't available that normally were. So I had to check all of those details. It's also a very tight timeline because there is mention that County's father and uncle were in World War I. They were actually, and I'm pretty specific about this in the book, but sometimes I get questions about it. They stayed in Europe as some of the last troops to come home, even after the official end of World War I. So it's a really tight timeline that I have had to check. I checked numerous times to make sure that worked. And that always makes me a little bit nervous about writing historical fiction. But I will say that there is one error in terms of the history or the research in the book that was pointed out to me later by a book club member. And I love it because I love when somebody reads this closely. So I don't mind when they bring this up. But there was a vehicle. County was driving a vehicle early in the book, well, actually throughout the book, and I changed the vehicle in one of the drafts, but what I didn't do was take the clutch out of the vehicle. And a lovely gentleman brought it to my attention at a book club one day that vehicle of that year did not have a clutch. And so there's all these details when someone's writing historical fiction that they've got to think of. And also keep in mind in the editing process that when one thing changes, the research may have to be redone to make sure that it's all accurate. So, but it was fun to kind of live in the past and talk about very contemporary issues. I often joke that I didn't consider that I was writing historical fiction until I had signed the contract and was working on the marketing plan with the publisher. Because I believe that all of these questions about identity and citizenship and belonging are very relevant to today. I certainly was thinking about missing and murdered Indigenous women when the diplomat's daughter goes missing. I was thinking about imprisonment all the way from the point of the stockades and the Trail of Tears to modern times of immigrants being in detention centers. So I think that while it's set in 1942, I think that it lends itself to a lot of conversations about contemporary issues as well. The other thing that I thought I'd talk about a little bit is what I mentioned earlier about how important it is for literature to be felt in the body. And sometimes people have questions about my process, and there's lots of ways to talk about my process of writing. But one of the aspects that it may be a little bit more unusual is that part of my process is riding a bike. I mountain bike, and so I use mountain biking to get my mind going about whatever I'm writing. And sometimes I will be on a bike and I will hone a sentence over and over in my head while I ride. Sometimes I'll work through plot problems while I ride. And sometimes just being out in the middle of the woods will give me a completely different perspective on my environment, something I never would have noticed if I was just trying to think about the woods and sit in front of my laptop at home. Just being in place is really important to me. So the last chapter that I wrote for the book, which ended up being chapter 2, was in response to needing a little bit more motivation for County to leave home. And I needed something that was more action driven, and I was really struggling with it. But I went on a bike ride with a friend, and we went down to the water, and in the middle of our ride to a river. And she looked at me and she said, you know, they used to float logs down this river. And sitting there and looking at the river, I thought, man, how terrifying would it be to fall in that river amongst those logs? And so it led to this chapter. So I think that I'll read this short chapter for you, and then that will leave us some time for questions. So as I read, if you have a question you want to throw into the chat, I'm happy to answer as many of those as we can get to today. So this is chapter 2. Bud had one more job to scrounge up before I left for the summer to work at the Grove Park Inn in Asheville. And though he would never admit it, he needed me. Bud and a few of his cronies had managed to covertly fell several trees following a major storm, but were unable to convince the remaining railroad bosses to haul the load to the lumber yard. The river, with its infinite ability to expand and contract due to cloudbursts or man's manipulation, offered the only solution. They would burden the beast that had been retired to farming life and drag the load to the Tuckasegee River. They'd dam it, anticipating the expected summer rains, and wait for the push. The Smokies had long been a logging economy, ending only with the inception of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I had mixed feelings on such and probably harbor more distaste for the industry in my later days, but back then, logging was just another way to survive. Bud made what semblance of a living he could out of those woods. As the logging companies dried up, he siphoned every last opportunity they leaked on their way out of town, as if it were maple sap. The timber companies used to build great splash dams to push their haul down the rivers into the timber yards. Railroads couldn't do all the work. The rivers and animals, as they always had, bore the burden of man's desire to do things faster and cheaper. I was seated on a stump at the lumberyard, removing my shoes at the edge of an ever-rising pool, watching the rounded, slick logs race down the river toward me. Waiting. My job was to be a river hog. Gas money, Bud reminded me. About time you get off the tee. Yeah, just try and relax, Thomas, a man I barely knew, nudged me. Ain't no big deal. Little did I know I'd hear those words again in only a matter of weeks. Just try and relax. It took me a while to understand why suspicion would feel so much like drowning. I know now it was those words that connected the sensations for me. It was those words that would outlast the men who spoke them. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The log runners, those skilled, balanced men who spun endlessly on the glassy logs, prodding them into alignment, had left with the last whistle. I knew with my foot as useless as it was, and well, to be honest, my body useless as a whole, I could never maneuver the way they had. I could swim though. I could swim for hours. Surely I could push a few dozen poles into their stalls from the pool's rim, and if need be, wade among them. I needed the money. Not just to put away, but to make sure I had the necessities when I got to Asheville. Places like that'll make you pay for your uniform before you even clock in. That's how you become more of an indentured servant than free will staff, and I couldn't let that happen. Bud gave no direction on how to accomplish the objective. He told me where to wait, where the logs should rest, and to keep my mouth shut about the splash pool to anyone else. The logs rushed down the river in a collective heap, fast and bulging from the waters like dark storm clouds mounting. I immediately felt my pulse quicken, and I turned, momentarily considering leaving this impending mess to Bud alone. How could I corral such a force of nature? It was obvious I would never be able to swim between the poles as I had imagined. I would need to, at the very least, mount them on all fours to float among them. I've tried many times to recall what happened next, but much of it will forever be blackened from my memory. Here's what I know. I was wet, head to toe, submerged in the frigid spring waters. I felt slick bark on my fingertips and managed to pull my torso atop one undulating log until I became nauseated from the pressure against my gut. I found some sort of strength, some sort of urgency that pulled me into a straddle position. And then I made the mistake of trying to stand. This lasted no discernible time because the balance of my memory is veiled by water and darkness and desperation. I've had a similar sensation when I drive beneath a bridge in a rainstorm. There is a brief void of silence, and then everything rushes in again. In this case, the void was when my head dipped below the water, suffocating my senses. Logs were coming faster, and the pool was rimmed 3, sometimes 5 deep. To reach the bank, I would have to scramble over multiple rows of huge trees. I ducked beneath the surface as each new wave came, fearful that the next time I tried to emerge, there would be no space for my body, or that space would be swallowed, crushing me. I couldn't see a thing beneath the surface. The water reddened with clay and frayed bark. I was blind. Calling for help was a waste of time. The skeleton crew of men were stationed elsewhere. My survival was my own. I forcefully pushed my legs downward, propelling my torso above the surface as far as I could, like a trout gasping in silted waters. I inhaled deep and sank just as quickly as I had risen. And then I swam. I swam as hard and as straightforward as I could manage, knowing that coming up for air was no longer an option. Logs loomed overhead, blanketing the surface and blocking the sunlight. I swam until my lungs no longer held, and I expelled a burst of bubbles. What I felt was surely my last contribution to this earth. I waited for my body to rise and rest beneath the barrier of wood, having nothing left in me to breach it. And just as my body began to rise, my fingertips sank into soft mud. I had reached an edge. I could stand. I clawed my way up the receding bank until my face rested on grass and air once again filled my lungs. I tried to blink my eyes open, but they were stung by splinter remnants of fresh light. I'm unsure how long I lay there, but it was Bud's voice I heard first, followed shortly by other men's. They were laughing. He was not. "Get up," he roared, rolling me over with his boot and pointing the way to his truck. I never saw a dollar from that day, and we didn't speak again until I returned to his cabin one last time before leaving for Asheville. This was all I needed to assure me that if I stayed, if I became Bud's dispensable errand boy, I would die young, if not physically, most assuredly spiritually. My father had not died for his country merely to have his son die for someone else's pocket change. So that is after the experience of a bike ride. We're actually in Georgia on that ride, but again, it's all about that physicality that's important to me in my riding. I want to share one quick story, and then we'll take questions. Sometimes when I do these talks, I'll get messages from people who have a little bit of history of their own to share about this time period or place. And it's been a little while ago, several months ago, but I had a gentleman email me and tell me that we had been talking about the monkey Edgar in the book, and he told me that there used to be a store in downtown Asheville, and the storekeeper kept a monkey as a pet. And local children would go to the store and kind of see the monkey and play with the monkey. And then they would go up to the Grove Park Inn that summer of 1942 when the diplomats and foreign nationals were outside on the property inside the fence. And these children would climb the fences and act like monkeys, mocking the prisoners. That's something I didn't know when I wrote the book, but to me, it's such a crazy example of how fiction and fact intertwine in ways we don't expect sometimes. It's really kind of horrific imagery to think of these kids doing that, but it's so odd that there was that connection of the monkey to historical truth, right? And then the other final thing I'll say, just in terms of history again, is that Asheville is Cherokee land. It's historically Cherokee land, and so it's very possible that there are Cherokee bones in the ground in Asheville. In fact, I know that there are. But also, there's a canoe race in the book, and that's based on the fact that Cherokees used to go to Asheville and race canoes on the river. So I just really want to capture all of those all that connective tissue, right, between place that really spans across time for our area. So that I will take questions now. I think Bobby is supposed to moderate those, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Yes, hello, that'd be me. So first question we have here is Allison says, the sense of place is so strong and beautiful. I felt like I was in the mountains. And and she continues, follows this up with a question. Had you always meant to tell it from County's point of view, or did you ever think of telling it from Essie's?
Yeah, it may sound odd that I didn't start telling it from Essie's point of view, but County's voice was always pretty clear to me, and I think that maybe for a few reasons. I wanted a character who was vulnerable, but also very curious, and so kind of on that it's kind of a coming of age story, right? I needed a character who was willing to take a little bit of risk, but was still unsure of himself. And I teach high school. I've got teenage boys right outside this door right here that may be County. I don't. And so I have I grew up with a lot of guy friends and have an older brother, and I just have always found that phase in a young man's life interesting, where he might not like to play school, may not fit in at school in that structure so well, but definitely has a bright future ahead of him, definitely intelligent, and is trying to find his way. Essie, for me, always knew, she thought she knew what she wanted. She's always very determined, and I needed someone with a little less self-confidence. And so that young male voice always kind of struck me as who needed to tell this story. I'd also, the kind of framework for the narrator's voice, I think is heavily influenced by Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, because I teach that book. And that's a memoir, a letter from a father to his son, that I found compelling. I think, it's different to write a memoir than fiction, but I like the way in which it connected across generations, but also it felt like there was an intimacy with the reader. So I knew pretty early on I wanted to do that first person voice. But I spent a lot of time thinking about voice. I'm sure there were moments where I was like, well, let me try this from Essie's point of view, but it certainly was not long lived.
What would you say was your biggest challenge writing the whole book?
I think the biggest challenge for me, and what I had the most conversations with my editor about, were capturing the racial tension of the time period in a way that was true to that time period, and also subtle and not completely overt, not too heavy-handed. I think that the racism in general, or bigotry, or discrimination, so often is subtle, it's systematic, it's kind of ever present right under the surface, especially now. But to show that in ways that they're just consistent and subtle and wear down on humanity. I wanted to make sure I did that, but also needed to really convey to readers that there is also this racial tension that's going on with County and the other folks at the inn. So I think balancing those two things was probably the most difficult for me.
I think you spoke a little bit about this at the beginning, but did you have a sort of message or thesis statement for the book that you wanted people to take away from it?
Yeah, I think so. The book is divided into 3 sections: bone, blood, and skin, as a way to capture these superficial ways in which we decide identity and belonging. And even the relationship between County and Essie is something I can't quite label. And so the real message is that it's the human spirit that should be the most important thing that connects us as people or determines, our sense of belonging in any community. So, the title is Even As We Breathe. There before editing, there used to be that line in the book. In fact, so the last paragraph of the book, it currently reads, however, it can also be said that bones shift and decay, blood dries and flesh withers. And the only thing separating us is the stories we choose to tell about them. Originally, it had said, however, it can also be said that bones shift and decay, blood dries and flesh withers, even as we breathe. But as a reference to the breath being the human spirit. There's some other references to that as well, but really just the message being that we should focus more on the human spirit than these temporal and superficial labels.
All right. I think we're all finished for the Q&A session here, but thank you very much, and I'll hand it back over to Stacy.
Thanks, Bobby. Thank you so much, Annette, for taking the time today to share your book with us. It's been so wonderful.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad we were able to make it work.
Us too. I hope that all of you joining us today will pick up your own copy if you haven't already. It's an incredibly impactful read and just so worth your time to read this. It's wonderful. And thank you to all those of you who joined us today. We hope that you will join us on the 20th for our 26th annual American Indian Heritage Celebration. It'll be an online experience this year. As I said, happening Saturday, November 20th from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. I put the link in the chat, but you can learn more by visiting ncmuseumofhistory.org. Thanks, you guys. Take care. We'll see you soon. Bye, everybody.